Hi, and welcome to the Resilience Podcast. It's Brad Hook here, and today I'm delighted to be joined by David Robson. David is an award-winning science writer specializing in the extremes of the human brain, body, and behavior. He graduated with a degree in mathematics from Cambridge, has worked at New Scientist, BBC Future, and his work has appeared in The Atlantic, The Observer, Washington Post. David's latest book, The Expectation Effect, is generating a lot of buzz around various podcasts, and I think it's really an important piece of work. So I'm excited to dive a little deeper today with David. Welcome to the Resilience Institute's podcast.
No, thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. Thank you for joining. I'd love to hear a little bit about you. How did you develop an interest in science writing, and particularly in exploring the human body and brain and performance?
Like you said, I did my degree in mathematics, but then when I started working at New Scientist, I was a feature editor, and I was just given this very open kind of brief. Like I could basically cover whatever I found interesting and whatever was going to appeal to the audience. So I very quickly kind of gravitated towards psychology, neuroscience and medicine because I just felt like a personal connection there. I'd always read books about psychology and neuroscience, and it just felt like I really clicked. I've always been interested in what we can do to improve ourselves, like how we work, how our minds work. And yeah, it just started from there and became more and more of a passion as my career progressed. So, I pursued that at the BBC, and then with my first book, The Intelligence Trap, and then The Expectation Effect, came about. Just for a really long-standing interest in the placebo effect. And then also there's a little bit of a personal story there as well, where I actually experienced the opposite of the placebo effect, the nocebo effect, where your expectations of illness can make you sick. And it was that experience that really kind of taught me how powerful expectations can be.
And in terms of the process of discovering that nocebo effect, would you mind sharing a little bit more about what you actually discovered?
Yeah, sure. So I was kind of going through a period of depression. I was taking some very standard antidepressant pills, and my doctor had warned me that, the pills as a side effect can cause you to kind of get quite bad headaches. And almost immediately after I started taking them, I did experience these really bad headaches. It was, quite painful. I'm not sure if it would count as a migraine, but it certainly made it very hard to kind of function in the day, to focus on my work. But it just happened that I was writing an article about this phenomenon, the nocebo effect. As I was researching that article, I found that actually a lot of drug side effects are caused by expectations, not by the direct effects of the pills themselves. And we know that because in clinical trials, you have to have people taking the active drug and people taking the sham placebo pill. And often the people taking the sham pill experience the same side effects as the people taking the real pill. And that was exactly the same. I looked into the research for the tablets I was taking in particular, and I found that was indeed the case, that actually these headaches were very common among people who were taking the placebo pills. And that realization actually, within a few hours of having that realization, kind of opening my mind up to this possibility that my headaches weren't this kind of inevitable consequence of taking the pills, but actually it might be created by my own expectations. That actually helped to resolve the pain, and it never really came back.
It's amazing.
And the pain when it was the pain when it was there was, it was very real to me. It was indistinguishable from any other headache I'd ever experienced. And looking into the science, I found out that actually you can even see physiological markers of the headaches when people have this kind of nocebo headache. So things like the brain's vasculature, it does change, like your blood vessels do become kind of more dilated when you're experiencing that pain. And so it just showed to me that actually, these kind of expectation effects can be profound, and I really wanted to know more and how they were affecting all areas of life. And I collected lots of research, and I found that actually expectation effects are not just a medical issue. They're affecting things like our responses to diet, to exercise, to sleep loss. They can even affect our aging. So it's very wide-ranging, the effects of our expectations.
It's amazing. When you consider how many of these nocebo effects must be out there, and we can dive a little deeper in a minute. But I thought important to differentiate, and you do this really well in the book, is there is a difference between, The Secret, Believe, and You Will Achieve, and chant a mantra and a bicycle will appear at your door, and what we're talking about here, which is a very different perspective. So I'd love to, if you could, just help differentiate those two.
I know lots of people have read The Secret and have found it very useful, and I'm not denying that actually it could be quite motivational for these people, but the kind of explanations that are given for this effect, this law of attraction, well, almost all scientists would consider that to be pseudoscience. It's not like you're sending energy out into the universe and then that's pulling stuff your way. Like, in my opinion, you can't just imagine yourself to become rich and then money's going to kind of come into your bank account. So, wish. Yeah, exactly, don't we all? Yeah, whereas if only it were that simple. But no, with the expectation effect is based on, peer-reviewed scientific studies. It's all kind of physiological, psychological, behavioural mechanisms that are very well understood. So there's no kind of woo-woo here. It's really just charting how widespread these effects are. It's very well grounded in evidence.
Maybe you could share a little bit about that mind-body connection. And from a resilience perspective, I think people are going to deal with challenges over the course of their lives. Whether you perceive the challenge as a threat or an opportunity really shapes your behavior. So I'd love to hear a little bit more, because I think this goes quite deep, perhaps all the way to the level of epigenetics and how your genes are expressed. I'd love to hear a little bit more about that mind-body connection, like what you believe, what you expect has a real impact on your body.
It does. And I mean, the kind of most well-studied example of this is the placebo effect in medicine. So, for a long time, scientists kind of just assumed that the sham pills were just helping people to kind of improve people's emotions. They're just helping to calm someone who is very anxious, maybe, someone who is a bit of a hypochondriac, and it was just kind of curing that kind of psychological discomfort without having any benefit to the body. Actually, like, we've discovered that the mind-body connection, is real, and so the placebo effect is more powerful than that. The best example is if you're taking a placebo painkiller, your brain is actually releasing these endogenous opioids or cannabinoids, very similar to the chemicals that you're actually getting in the real painkillers. And then that's reducing your pain through this kind of physiological process. Those endogenous chemicals, they can also do things like reduce your inflammation. So very much like you're seeing, a kind of measurable objective effect here, not just what the subject is reporting.
There are a few examples in the book, such as people being administered, it wasn't morphine, and managing to undergo surgery?
Yeah, exactly. So, this is this story. It doesn't come from a paper, so we can't be sure. But, it was what kind of inspired this guy to look into the placebo effect. And he was an anaesthetist during the Second World War, and he ran out of morphine. So his nurse used just saline injections. And actually, it seemed that on certain occasions, for quite a few soldiers, that they experienced the pain relief as if they were receiving the real morphine. Similarly, he was actually surprised to find that people coming off the battlefield often didn't require any pain relief at all, just because the relief of having left the battlefield was enough, that they were in this kind of euphoria where they weren't actually experiencing the pain from their wounds. So again, that showed there was this kind of very strong effect of our kind of psychological context that was determining kind of what people were experiencing. But what's important was that then this was followed up in really good scientific trials, and we know now that if you do give these placebo painkillers, telling someone that it's an opioid drug, that they do have that release of opioids in their brain. We also know that even if you're giving a real painkiller, the way you deliver it will change the pain relief. So if someone is receiving morphine, it really matters to have the interaction with the doctor, kind of telling them that they're receiving that. If you do have that kind of overt injection of the pain relief, the pain relief is about twice as big as if it's delivered surreptitiously through an intravenous drip. So the expectation there of getting the pain relief is almost as powerful as the drug itself.
Makes you think about, a visit to the GP. And for a long time, this has changed for me personally, but for a long time, if you weren't prescribed something, you felt a little shortchanged. Like, how can I get better if he or she didn't give me some medicine? And that's where I guess that placebo effect. And so doctors were actually prescribing a placebo as a common practice for a while.
Yeah, that's right. And I mean, there are recent surveys suggesting that, like, lots of doctors do prescribe placebos. I don't know how they do that while still kind of, being honest with their patients. But there are ways, I think, that they can do it. It's like, I think, I'd heard from one doctor friend that say, if you say my doctor giving my antidepressant tablets, like if you say, oh, well, if you take a big glass of water with each tablet, that will reduce the risk. That might help you to avoid the headaches. Well, that is kind of a placebo effect, but it's not really dishonest, because having the water may well help you to avoid that side effect.
Yes.
So I think it could be used in lots of ways like that. But also we know from studies that just the doctor's kind of manner and the way they delivered their information can be really important. So there were, patients going to their GP with a common cold. The doctor can't really give you any medication for the cold. But actually, just if they were warm and empathetic, and if they told the patient that, this will resolve itself quite quickly, if they were optimistic about how quickly they were going to recover, well, the patient did actually recover more quickly, by about a day. Which is quite a lot when you consider colds don't last that long anyway. And also that this was evident in, measures of immune activity within the nose, so kind of inflammation within the nose. That actually the immune system seems to be working a bit more efficiently with these people.
It's amazing. It's amazing. The power of that, just that ritual of seeing someone, talking about it, and then having something you can go away and do, and it has that actual physiological effect. It's amazing.
Other studies have shown, it's the same with, like, if you have like a kind of allergic reaction, a skin rash or something, and your doctor says, oh, just reassures you, it's nothing to worry about, it will go away. Those words are kind of biologically active, and we've never really accepted that before, that a doctor's words can be as important as the medication itself, that they're, if you go to the doctors and you're reassured, well, that in itself is a really important, like, a procedure medically. Yes.
Yeah, that should be part of the duty of care for surgery, post-surgery recovery, for example. Say most people, instead of these are all the things that might go wrong, these are all the things that will probably go right. And these are the positive things to expect. It's just a reframing exercise, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. And there have been studies of exactly that. People undergoing heart surgery have been given, a few sessions of psychological therapy, talking to a health psychologist about, what they're worried about with the procedure, and then kind of being reassured that some of those anxieties were, not really very objective, or, that they weren't founded in the truth about what normally happens for most patients. And then they were also given this help to kind of plan this kind of timeline for their recovery, which was just, very realistic based on what can happen. But, it was still helping to give them a good idea of, the benefits of the surgery. And what they found was that those patients, compared to people who were just having their treatment as normal, well, they, did recover more quickly. They left hospital a few days earlier. They returned to work, at 6 months, they're more likely to return to work compared to the people who just had the surgery without the additional psychological support.
It's encouraging to see. I don't know if you are aware of this, but in Canada, for example, the doctors have started prescribing time in nature. So prescribing time in a national park. I just love that idea of, we know that nature is good for you. It improves your immune function and so forth. But when a doctor prescribes it, you're more likely to take action.
Yeah, exactly. I think you're more likely to take action, and the benefits are probably going to be even greater. Because being, outside in nature, like you said, it's kind of been proven to be helpful. But I also think there is going to be an expectation effect here, and hearing that advice from an authority figure is going to make it more powerful.
So this is where it gets really interesting with in terms of placebo effect, and in the book you give a number of examples, and it crosses the line into more dubious territory, but in sporting performance. And this is really interesting from our resilience perspective. You know, a coach can give an athlete a placebo, PED, and their performance actually improves because they believe that they've been given some enhancement.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, so the example I use in my book is Richard Virenque from during the Tour de France in the late 90s. You know, he had heard that there was this, you know, drug going around that was meant to be amazing for the time trials, and he, you know, that the time trials weren't really his strength. So he asked, you know, his coach to get him some, and the coach was kind of dubious because it's like even though actually it seemed like the team were using performance enhancing drugs, he didn't want to try like a new one during this event, you know, without having tried it first. So he just basically replaced this, you know, magical substance with just with salt water and injected that into this athlete just before the event. And you know, the athlete did perform like so much better than he would have done. He had, you know, he said later he had the time trial of his life, and you know, the coach, it's all in his autobiography. He said that like you know, all Virenque needed really was just like a self-belief, and that alone was enough to help him to kind of to boost his performance. And you know, I think this kind of story is very common within sports and athletics. But you know, then it's been tested kind of scientifically, and we do know that actually for a lot of performance enhancing drugs, like a big component of the, you know, their effects actually comes from expectation. We also know this from other kinds of sports supplements. So, you know, caffeine, for example, if you take caffeine to kind of increase your strength, well, actually a lot of that is a placebo effect. And what the research has shown is that if you have a decaf with the belief that it's got a lot of caffeine in, that can be more powerful actually than if you have caffeine itself. If you have caffeine itself, but you're told that it's a placebo. So, you know, the effect there is, you know, really significant, as we saw with morphine. It's actually, you know, how you interpret what you're taking that matters as much as the chemicals themselves.
Amazing. And do you think there is a mechanism behind this as well? I remember reading that, you know, we don't use our full capacity when we, for example, exercise, because the body tries to protect us from exhaustion. So can you access that little bit more of untapped potential through the belief that it's possible, or the expectation?
Yeah, I mean, that is the idea here, is that we have, it's like, so the brain is acting as this prediction machine, and it's kind of simulating the challenges we're going to face. And especially with something like exercise, it's always trying to calculate, like, what resources do we have, you know, in our body that will allow us to, you know, kind of achieve this goal without risking injury or full exhaustion. Because, you know, if you are exhausted, you know, that would have, evolutionarily speaking, that would have put you in danger then from predators, from other, you know, people in your group. So, you know, it's always erring on the kind of side of caution, essentially. So it's when it's calculating what output we can achieve and then kind of allowing those muscle movements, it's always making sure that we're well away from risking exhaustion or injury. And what seems to be happening is that when you have these placebos, or when your expectations are modified through other means, it's just helping to make that estimation, that calculation, a little bit less conservative, so that you're still, the brain is still allowing your body to use more of its resources. So one obvious way that we can measure that is through the muscle fibers that are recruited in the limbs. And research has shown that even when an athlete is performing at, you know, what they think is their full capacity, still only about 50 or 60% of the muscle fibers are being activated. And it seems that when you know, take a placebo, or when someone gives you kind of a confidence boost before a race, then, you know, you're just going to be recruiting a few more of those, and that could actually improve your time significantly.
So it's very interesting when you consider the future of sports, and I suppose that's where chemicals like cortisol and adrenaline come in, because I can practice and I feel exhausted, but if a lion wanders into the room, you can suddenly access so much more. That capability is always there.
Yeah, exactly. And that's, what the prediction machine is also kind of weighing up. Well, what are the potential benefits of me risking exhaustion? And essentially, it's only going to kind of risk exhaustion if it's a matter of life or death. So yeah, very much like how you're appraising the goal, as well as how you're appraising your own resources. Both are really important.
Yeah. Yeah, it makes sense then to see people who push themselves beyond their perceived limits, and then they establish that new baseline. And we're fascinated with people like Wim Hof, who can sit in ice water, but he's really just trained himself in small increments to deal with that discomfort, I suppose.
Yeah, exactly. And I actually see all kind of training as being a matter of like brain training as well as like training your body. I think for a lot of people, when they first go to the gym, their brain is kind of putting on, really strict limits on what it's allowing the body to do because it's not used to exercise. It's appraising the symptoms of exercise, the kind of aching muscles, shortness of breath, racing heart. It's like really appraising that as kind of a sign of danger because it's not used to performing those activities.
Yeah.
So actually, yeah, I think especially in the first few weeks or months of like training, if you've been a bit of a couch potato, so much more is happening in your brain probably than actually like training the body itself. You're really getting the brain used to doing the exercise and trying to find where its limits are, kind of pushing that boundary just further and further out. And that's why I think for, casual exercisers as much as for, world-class athletes, is really important to understand the expectation effect because, we can consciously try to change the way we're making those appraisals. We can, by learning to see the, things like the muscle aches as actually being like a positive attribute of having done the exercise as something that's kind of proof that you've pushed your body as far as it can go to kind of build strength. Just by seeing it like that can actually change the whole experience of the exercise and boost your performance. The study's shown that when you do reappraise your muscle aches in that way, that actually helps to release those endogenous opioids, those painkillers. So it's actually, you're more likely to, not suffer such bad aches, but also have that kind of runner's high afterwards. It's going to be kind of like an endorphin rush then.
Yeah, and this applies equally to, think of a business context. Many people view stress as being negative. If I had a stressful day, that's a terrible thing. But imagine if you could have the expectation that, tomorrow I'm going to be able to handle a little bit more. Obviously, taking the approach of an athlete and balancing high performance with care and recovery, because you can't just function at that unsustainable high level forever. But I had a really stressful day, and that's a good thing. What I'm going to do tonight is go to bed a little earlier so that I'm nice and energized tomorrow. I mean, that's a completely different way of looking at modern work.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, our culture hasn't been great at having like this nuanced view of stress, essentially. Like I think even a lot of public health campaigns do paint stress as just this kind of killer and something that's, inevitably going to lead to burnout. But actually, stress evolved, like the stress response evolved for a, good reason. It's adaptive because when you're feeling some of those physiological signs of anxiety, like if your heart is racing a little bit faster, if, you feel kind of a bit on edge, like charged, well, actually that's the cortisol is kind of keeping you alert. The oxygen in your blood, which is being pumped around, that's helping to fuel your brain to help you to think your way out of the problem that you're facing. These are, it's you don't want to be, if you're facing like a challenge, you don't want to be kind of sleepy and drowsy. You want to be kind of performing at your peak. And that's really what the stress response is doing. And especially in, I'm not really talking here about when people are facing kind of chronic life stresses or like something like grief or bereavement, but actually for the stresses that we often have in our day-to-day work, it's often because we're stressed because it's important for our growth, but then we don't see the stress response as being positive. We see it as actually harming our performance. And what the research shows is that if you can change that attitude in the way that you suggested, if you can see the stress that you're feeling as actually serving some kind of purpose, it's telling you that this is important, and then it's helping to prepare you to deal with that that challenge as best as you can. Or when you change people's mindsets like that, it does improve their immediate performance, and it's much more effective than trying to just suppress the stress. But also it changes your physiology too. So, changes that balance of hormones that you're releasing. So you do have the cortisol, but you also have positive, like anabolic hormones that are important for kind of tissue growth and maintenance. So it's that kind of ratio of hormones is a healthier balance, which means that you're less likely to suffer from the long-term effects of stress. And also you recover much more quickly. So, if you have that kind of stressful presentation in the day, well, you can then go back to feeling much more relaxed later on. Whereas if you have the negative view of stress and you've really built it up in your mind and you felt that the stress itself was kind of debilitating, harming your performance, that it was bad for you, then your recovery is actually so much slower. And I think that's what's important here, is to be able to kind of have that acute stress, but then to be able to get better very quickly. And that's what then, if you can deal with stress in that way, you're much less likely to suffer from burnout and all of those other longer term effects of stress.
And do you think it is important for people to establish those rhythms of, stress is healthy and normal, but in order to sustain my performance, I will prioritize micro breaks, for example, so that I can reduce my cortisol, recalibrate, refocus, reflect maybe, and then continue, rather than just, I sometimes say, so many of us are running on a hamster wheel. It's a life by default rather than a life by design. Surely we can harness the stresses and actually enjoy the challenges, but it does require rhythm.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we should do, I think the danger of learning about the positive stress mindset is that actually you can just kind of think, oh, well, I can just take on more and more and more without kind of worrying about my well-being. And that's not really what the research is saying at all. It's actually, just helping you to deal with some stressful events without kind of catastrophizing them and without exacerbating the stress response. But you certainly you want to still be realistic in your routines and to try to, like you say, have this kind of balance where you're also allowing yourself to rest more quickly. I think what having the positive stress response does is it just helps to make those breaks in your day more effective. I also think because otherwise, I've done this myself when I've had the negative stress mindset, is that I might kind of take a walk or whatever to try to reset, my mind. But all I'm doing is ruminating and worrying during that break. Whereas I think if you have the positive stress mindset, you're more likely to be able to use that break for recovery. And the positive stress mindset has other benefits, I think, that help us to deal with our stresses more proactively. So it does actually, it promotes this kind of approach rather than avoidance kind of behaviour. So you're more likely to deal with the underlying problems of what's making you stressed. It can boost your creative thinking, so you can find better solutions to what's making you stressed. So I think in that way, it's also helping you to minimize the source of the stress. It's definitely not all about just kind of piling on the stress and then, kind of getting on with it like a trooper. I don't think that's a healthy attitude at all.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Something I'd love to talk about is the psychogenic effect and collective expectation effects. And there's a really interesting study that you referenced in the book about young people in Portugal who watched a TV series and then suddenly developed all kinds of symptoms. This can happen not just at an individual level, but at a group level as well.
Yeah, exactly. So this is very much related to the nocebo effect. But what happens is that actually you don't have to be told, with words that you're going to become ill, like I was with, my when my doctor told me about the drug side effects. Often it's just enough to observe someone else who's ill, and then you start to feel that sickness yourself. We know that the brain has this kind of mirroring system, so that kind of helps you it's kind of one source of empathy. So if someone else is feeling happy or sad, the same brain areas in your own brain start to kind of become more active to help you to understand what they're feeling. And that actually happens with kind of illnesses too. your brain starts to respond a bit as if you're experiencing those symptoms that the other person is having. So this is how kind of illnesses can become contagious. In this particular case, the soap opera was called Strawberries with Sugar. It was like this teen soap opera, and there was this kind of mystery pandemic within the school. And then, just like in Portugal, like a few children started kind of fainting and kind of showing all of these symptoms that had been kind of prevalent in the program. And then what I think happened is that then their classmates started to see that as well. It's much more powerful if you're seeing someone in real life. And so, about 200 children were hospitalized. They're all fine after, the cause had been discovered and they were discharged. But it did show how actually even something as silly as a soap opera could have this kind of effect. But then, in globally, actually, there's lots of other cases where this is happening. Some neurologists have suggested that the Havana syndrome, so these symptoms that, ambassadors, diplomats in Cuba were experiencing, which they believed was due to some kind of sonic weapon employed by the government, that actually that was probably a similar kind of contagious nocebo effect. That one person had become ill, then other people had observed them, they became ill, and then this story that had emerged about them being kind of under attack, well, that had caused more and more people within the American community there to become sick. We can never know if that's the case or not completely, but it certainly seems likely to me that at least some of those people were experiencing a nocebo effect, because then you did see similar cases in embassies across the world, and no weapon has been discovered that would do that, certainly not in all these different locations, and even the leads they thought they had, like when someone thought they'd recorded the sound of this kind of sonic weapon that was making them ill, that turned out to be, just the sounds of insects outside kind of buzzing away. So, so I think we have to be cautious, because who knows, maybe there will be some resolution to the mystery, but we shouldn't neglect the possibility that it could be this kind of contagious nocebo effect, because, what's really important to understand is that when someone has a psychogenic illness, when they become ill in this way, whether it's headaches, whether it's nausea, whether it's fainting, dizziness, all of those things, that they are, like my own headaches were when I was taking those antidepressants, they're very real to the person. They're experiencing them just as if there was some kind of very clear kind of biological cause. So their suffering is absolutely just as important and should be treated in just the same way, with just the same seriousness. These people aren't making up their illnesses, they're actually experiencing them.
They're experiencing them. And in some cases, it can be more challenging for them to heal and recover than someone who actually has the illness.
Yeah, that's right. Because often, if you can identify the biological cause, you can, give someone a drug or, whatever therapy that will cure that. But I think the problem is we have so much stigma around psychogenic illnesses that lots of patients, quite understandably, are very resistant to the term. And, even health professionals don't help this. I've heard that there's a lot of prejudice even amongst kind of certain health professionals, that they see a psychogenic illness as just being malingering. But the neurologists who studied them, they know that this isn't the case, and these people are not choosing to be ill, they're not acting, they are actually sick. And so we need to overcome that stigma, I think, for people to then be able to accept the psychological therapies that could help with something like a psychogenic illness.
Because there is actual inflammation taking place. Like the mind has, whether it's real or not, something's happened, something's changed in the environment, and the body prepares to help you, to fight off the infection, whatever it might be.
Yeah, that's exactly it. So many things, biological things could change, like inflammation. If you're feeling nausea, well, that could actually be through objective changes to your digestive activity. If your headaches, it could be the release of, certain neurotransmitters, or the change in the blood vessel dilation. All of these things could be happening, so you really are experiencing it. It's not caused by this kind of biological agent or this sonic weapon that you believe is there. It's caused more by your expectations.
And that's the gluten example, and we don't need to go into it, but my partner thinks she's allergic to gluten, and we had a meal that included some couscous, and halfway through, she said, "Hold on, what is couscous made from?" I said, "Oh, it's gluten-free. It's like buckwheat." She's like, "Oh, great. There was no inflammation afterwards." I don't want, she'll find out now. but it is interesting. It is interesting to see.
Yeah, exactly. And, so absolutely, like lots of people have, celiac disease, which is, quite a severe reaction to gluten. Other people might have a kind of sensitivity to some of the carbohydrates that you find in wheat products that coincide with gluten. So, certainly, for a sizable number of people, like there is a kind of direct biological origin to the sickness they feel when they eat wheat products. But we also do know that with the kind of press coverage that we've had around gluten sensitivity, there's been a huge increase. I think there was one study showing that over 3 years in the UK, the number of people reporting this had increased by 250%. So that seems quite extraordinary if there isn't some kind of expectation effect. And then what these studies have done is they've, much like with your girlfriend actually, is that they would arrange these trials where people would be given either, a kind of muffin with wheat in or a muffin without wheat, but neither the kind of scientist or the patient knew which was which. They'd give them that, record the symptoms, give them the other one, record the symptoms, repeat this multiple times. And what you'd find is, 16% of people only responded to the muffins with wheat. So you can be very sure that they have this kind of biological reaction. But a much bigger proportion, 40% of people responded to both, and that's because of the expectation effect. Even when they were taking the placebo without the wheat, the expectation that it contained wheat was causing them to feel those symptoms.
It's a real call to action, I think, for leaders and also for us as individuals, to be discerning about what we consume in terms of ideas. Consuming, I think I read that 9 out of 10 news articles are negative because it triggers the fight-flight response, and we're more likely to click on ads and spend time reading. But it is a call to action to be discerning when it comes to what we're reading and what we believe and how we respond to this. And as a leader in an organization, for example, emotional contagion, social contagion is real. If I walk into the office and I say, the world is falling apart and we're never going to overcome these obstacles, the collective expectation is that we're under attack.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, so I do think applying critical thinking to, say, health scares, is really important. Kind of just questioning, the quality of the studies that, the newspapers are citing, especially if you hear, reports that wind farms are causing some kind of wind farm syndrome in your area, just questioning, well, actually, were some people reporting their symptoms before they came? Like, is there a good control group to actually check that there is causality? All of that kind of thing can be really useful. But I totally agree. We need this in organisations as well. Like, leaders should be thinking about their own mindsets. And I think when it comes to something like stress, there is good evidence showing that those mindsets can be contagious. So, studies of athletes, for example, found that if you have team members that have the positive stress mindset, well, then that helps to kind of spread to the other team members, so they all perform better under pressure. If you have someone who's constantly catastrophizing about the pressure that they're under, they're adding this layer of anxiety about their anxiety on top of the pressure of the game, then actually they're suffering, but so are the other members of the team. So, we have to think about the way we talk about these things like stress and how that might be affecting the people around us.
Yeah, great point. So, in wrapping up, I'd love to get maybe some practical takeaways for anyone who wants to implement the expectation effect. Where do people start besides reading the book?
Well, I do think, often, the way we reframe situations to kind of to combat negative expectations, well, that does depend, on the kind of domain you're talking about. But there are some general rules, and I think one of them is just to kind of question your assumptions and to notice when you might be catastrophizing a situation. So, for example, if you're experiencing pain, it's very easy for us to go into this kind of negative loop where you start to think, it's not just that you're suffering from the pain, but then you start thinking that the pain itself must be a sign of something like catastrophic happening within your body, that it must be a disaster, that you're never going to get better from the pain, that you can't cope with the pain, that it's, you can have all of those thoughts, and actually just kind of stepping back and questioning those assumptions, and maybe trying to remember, for example, if you're having a migraine, trying to remember other situations where, even though the pain was really bad in the moment, that it did recede over time. Just breaking that negative cycle of thinking can be very powerful.
Yes.
And I think we see exactly the same with stress. If you can start to go down this kind of, it's almost like a runaway train where you're feeling anxious, and then you're feeling that the anxiety is going to make you fail, and then you start thinking about the consequences of the failure and how that might impact your career, and then you start thinking about what's going to happen if you lose your job. You're going down that train of thought that's like, not necessarily founded in reality. So actually breaking yourself away from all of those negative expectations and dealing with the kind of foundation, which is this idea that the stress is going to harm your performance, and then just questioning that idea and wondering whether actually the stress could be beneficial to your performance. That's what we need to do. Basically, number one thing is to avoid the catastrophizing. Number two is to then try to see if there's a more positive way of reframing what you're going through. And that's the same with exercise, sleep loss, you might go to sleep and you might feel, and then you might wake up, you might have a slight disturbance, and you could start telling yourself these stories that you're not going to be able to function the next day. That makes you more anxious, and then that actually has knock-on effects on how you perform. Just questioning, well, is that true? Or actually, despite having lost an hour of sleep, did I sleep well either side of that? Did I get enough to function okay? In all of these situations, it's the same process. And I think that's the fundamental idea here, is to avoid the catastrophizing and then to try to look for the more positive interpretation. And just remember that I'm not saying we have to be this kind of Pollyanna figure who's always optimistic. Absolutely recognize your discomfort, acknowledge, how you're feeling, but just don't get kind of carried away and immersed in that. My second tip to help with that process would be to use a process called self-distancing, which was developed by Ethan Cross at the University of Michigan. And that's imagining that you're advising a friend who's going through the situation that you're going through. And that can be very helpful in breaking that kind of negative, immersive rumination and helping you to see your situation more objectively, which in turn helps you to change your expectations in a more positive way. It just kind of gives you a little bit of space to think about, what you're going through and to question your assumptions.
So powerful, really powerful in developing your self-awareness, and maybe a little dose of self-compassion as well, to say, hey, it's not all bad, right?
Right.
You'll be okay, and being able to do that to yourself, it's powerful.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, yes, the self-compassion is my kind of third piece of advice, really, which is, there's a danger with any kind of self-help book, and maybe especially this one, that you could start adding another layer of anxiety in your life because you're constantly worried, is my mindset positive enough? And if you fail, you think it's just because you didn't have the positive mindset. But actually, you can have a positive mindset, but it doesn't mean you're invincible, and it doesn't mean that sometimes you're going to have disappointments. So actually just being kind to ourselves about that, to kind of recognize that, having disappointments and failures is actually a universal condition. And if you're striving for growth, you're always going to have situations that sometimes, where you perform worse than you'd hoped, because that's what growth is all about, is then learning from that experience. So just being kind to yourself is so important, and recognizing, I think, that you're trying to focus on the trajectory. So each individual, performance or challenge might be important, but what you really want is to kind of see incremental improvements rather than always hoping to, achieve kind of miracles with every challenge that you face.
And actually building into your expectation that sometimes things are going to go badly. And that's normal and fine too. I think that's, if people built into that, you can't achieve unsustainable growth without, growth is painful. Think of what it's like being a kid. I remember growing pains, being awkward. But as long as you're on that trajectory, as you say, that's the main thing.
Yeah, that's exactly it. And I think we should see this as, see those kind of disappointments as growing pains and looking at them for what we can really learn from those experiences. Whether, it could be that you learn something about your mindset. Maybe you learn, that you were catastrophizing in a way that wasn't healthy, or maybe it's something totally different. But actually just recognizing that those, and recognizing that even the feeling of disappointment is itself valuable. So rather than beating yourself up about feeling disappointed, just recognizing that actually you're feeling that because it's teaching you a lesson. It's kind of telling you this was important for me, like I didn't get what I want, and your disappointment is then helping you to learn kind of how you could improve in the future.
It's a positive signal.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Amazing. Thank you so much. It's been a real pleasure. What's next for you? Can you reveal your next plans, your next area of focus, or is it secret?
So I'm writing, I'm just starting to kind of write a book about expectations again, but this time in the social sphere. So how, our beliefs about ourselves and other people can shape our relationships and can sometimes act as like needless barriers to connection.
Awesome. Can't wait to get my hands on that. David, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure. It's gone really fast. I could talk to you for days probably. Really appreciate your time. And I know our audience will as well. They can connect with you. All of your details will be in the show notes. So thank you again for taking the time to chat.
No, thanks for such great questions. It's been my pleasure.
Thank you so much. Thanks, everyone, for tuning in to the Resilience Podcast, and I'll see you in the next episode. See you.